America is obsessed with the rags to riches story.
It embodies the American dream, which is to make something out of nothing. So it's not surprising that people like Cardi B have been able to capture the attention of millions of fans as she tells her story of her meteoric rise from being a stripper and gang member in the Bronx to becoming a top-selling, Grammy Award-winning female rapper. But stories like hers are rare. According to a report by The Guardian, only about 8% of US children from the bottom 20% of the economic ladder actually make it to the top 20% as adults. So, teachers told me to stay in school. It maximized my chances of being part of that lucky 8% that would make it out of San Francisco's Tenderloin district. But the Tenderloin district was no ordinary neighborhood. The city had neglected it for decades, and now it was filled with poverty, crime, drug use, homelessness, homeless tents, human feces, and urine all over the streets. This was a biohazard that wasn't safe for anybody to live in. But my family's one-bedroom apartment wasn't much better. It was filled with mice, mold, and the notorious San Francisco chilly air that the poor insulation let in. And with homophobic parents threatening to kick me out, I needed to find a safety net fast. So I looked at what other college students in San Francisco were doing to survive. Now, most of them picked up a full-time minimum wage job. This was what was most accessible to them as high school seniors or high school graduates. Maybe this could have been a good way out. Well, upon further inspection, I saw that it was these same people that stood outside food banks because they couldn't afford their next meal. They also had trouble paying rent sometimes. $15 an hour or $2,400 a month just wasn't enough to survive in a city where the average one-bedroom apartment costs $2,800. So with some research, I reasoned that prostitution was my best option. In just a couple hours of work every week, I could make more than enough money to save up about a year's worth of living expenses just in case my parents kicked me out. But I wasn't naive to the dangers of prostitution. I knew that prostitutes were far more likely to be victims of serial killers than the average US citizen. I also knew that the police didn't really care about our deaths. Why would they waste time and money investigating the murder of someone who likely wouldn't be missed when they were gone? Prostitutes were rarely reported missing in the first place. So to the police, prostitutes were just objects for rape, sex extortion, and incarceration during sting operations. But the opportunity was too good to pass up. So I put my first ad up on a prostitution board, and in less than a day, I had my first client. Now, after exchanging a couple text messages, I knew his age, location, and appearance. I also knew what he wanted: a 30-minute blowjob for $300. But this outcall was just further from the city than I liked. He offered to drive me to his place, though, so on the day we were supposed to meet, I waited for him by a deserted subway station. Eventually, a gray sedan pulled up, and I got in. As soon as we drove off, he told me to turn off my phone. In any horror movie, I would end up dead. I was ready to jump out of that car if I had to, even though we were speeding onto a highway at 50 miles an hour. But after a couple minutes of small talk, I learned that he didn't mean any harm. You see, because I was new to prostitution, I wasn't used to the coded language that many prostitutes and clients used to allude to transactional sex. So, because I was so blunt with my conversations about sex, he thought that I could have been part of some police sting operation and was ready to entrap him in a compromising situation. Obviously, this wasn't the case, but this wasn't an irrational thought. Police sting operations targeting both the prostitute and the client were very common at the time and even today. So if caught, we would be fined, jailed, and charged with a misdemeanor, and his career as a researcher and professor at a top university would be over. So the man I thought would murder me actually feared me. Now, I also had a lot to lose if I was caught. You see, I risked my life and my professional career every time I saw a new client. The more I engaged in prostitution, the more likely I was to just encounter that wrong person, and most of the time, that would be a cop or a murderer. I would have rather met a murderer any day. It sounds strange, because a misdemeanor can be expunged after a while, but successive charges were inevitable with survival sex, and if I was caught again, my misdemeanor could be promoted to a felony. Employment opportunities would be incredibly scarce with a felony, if they weren't already with a misdemeanor, and even my college financial aid package could be jeopardized with a felony charge for a sex crime. And I was unwilling to give up my education. It was my best way out of the Tenderloin. So at that time, I also looked at applying to transfer from my college in San Francisco to an elite university. Elite universities had always marketed themselves as gatekeepers to near guaranteed social mobility for low-income students. But there was no roadmap for leaving prostitution and entering elite higher education. But I knew I needed to secure a position at an elite university somehow. All I could really do was apply. But when I did, I saw that many of these universities asked for my criminal history. This made me nervous. If my next client was a cop waiting to arrest me, I would likely be automatically rejected from many of these universities. My best ticket out of the Tenderloin district would have been ripped away from me by the police. I would have rather been dead. Still, I'll admit that it wasn't all bad. I had plenty of opportunities to just have fun and explore my sexuality with my clients. It wasn't unusual for them to make fetish or BDSM requests, which I very much indulged in and entertained. And it also wasn't unusual for them to build very close relationships with me. For instance, a former client of mine that learned of my living situation in the Tenderloin even housed me temporarily while I was back in San Francisco for summer and winter break, which I'm very grateful for. But after 2 years in the sex industry, I was burnt out. Transactional sex wasn't fun for me anymore, so I had to find something else. Coincidentally, I was accepted by a couple elite universities at this time and chose Vanderbilt, which was my most affordable option. Now, this could have been a good time to leave prostitution, considering I was moving to a new state and had a full ride to Vanderbilt. But I wasn't convinced just yet. You see, during last Thanksgiving break, prior obligations, mainly health appointments and important face-to-face meetings, forced me to go back to San Francisco. But I couldn't stay at my former client's place this time, and I was very much unwilling to stay at my parents' place. So I could either live on the streets or a homeless shelter, both of which were equally bad options, or I could find the money to afford a week's stay in a hotel in one of the most expensive cities in the world during the holiday season. Now, I chose that latter option because it was my safest bet, but I had to come up with this money somehow. The most accessible way for a college student to come up with that money was likely just getting a campus job. But campus jobs only paid $10 an hour. This was nothing in San Francisco, where people were struggling on $15 an hour. So if I were to make enough money through a campus job, I would have to sacrifice time spent pursuing extracurricular activities like scientific lab research and freelance writing, both of which were important for the long-term goal: education, or employment after education. And I couldn't forget about that. That was the reason why I came to an elite university in the first place. So once again, prostitution was my best option. But as a first semester senior at the time, I was very hesitant to re-enter the field. I was so close to being part of that lucky 8% that would make it out of the Tenderloin district. I couldn't be caught by the police now of all times. But the opportunity was just too good to pass up, so I took it. Now, stories like mine are not unheard of in higher education. According to the Harvard Public Health Review, about 5% of US college students have joined the sex industry to pay for college. And these students do it all, from legal stripping, porn, and webcamming, to illegal prostitution. And colleges have a duty to care for all of their students, including this subset. But colleges don't really do that. You know, most of them try to in some way. For instance, many colleges send representatives, both student and administrative, to places like Capitol Hill. And there, they tell stories of, say, low-income students. And in doing so, they aim to set the stage for improvements in federal financial aid policies. But stories of student sex workers, especially student prostitutes, are often unheard of or forgotten about in these spaces. And this isn't really surprising. Directly advocating for safer, perhaps even decriminalized prostitution is far too taboo. It would garner mixed reviews from legislators and the general public who are still debating the morality of prostitution. However, advocating for increased educational access for lower income students is far more fashionable and generally uncontested in higher education. But what good does an increase in federal financial aid do for a student prostitute whose education is so easily derailed by a single misdemeanor or felony? Then, decriminalizing prostitution becomes an educational issue that is just as worthy of a council on Capitol Hill. Now today, I hope that I've changed your idea of who a prostitute is. You may not have thought that a prostitute could make it to an elite university and study molecular and cellular biology. I sure didn't when I first applied. We're plenty smart, but even if we aren't, we're still worthy of human decency. But to the legal and educational system, people like me are just criminals who are not worthy of any legally legitimate form of social mobility, including higher education. But what if we want to leave prostitution? When will our stories finally be heard? Thank you.